Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker. This is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about how we can respond to the brokenness in our lives and in our society, and how we can do that with our whole selves, head, heart, and hands. Today, I get to talk to Pastor Rich Villodas about spiritual practices that can center us and ground us so that we can go into the world and love others and participate in God's reconciling activity and forgive and show compassion and seek justice. So we can do all of those things from a place of wholeness and not from a place of fear of being depleted, so that we can go out in love instead of fear. Before I get to that interview, one quick reminder. As the season of Lent approaches, I do have a new devotional book out, and it walks through each day of this season with a short spiritual reflection and a weekly set of questions for further reflection or discussion. And I'd love for you to check it out. You can go to amyjuliabecker.com and look under the resources tab. There are physical paperback books for sale as well as ebooks. And they're really should be great for you or for a group. And now let's get to my interview with Rich Villodas. Well, I'm here today with Rich Villodas, lead pastor at New Life Fellowship, which from the book jacket that I've read, at least, is a large multiracial church in New York City. He is also the author of The Deeply Formed Life. It is a wonderful book. I just had the great pleasure of reading it over the course of the last few weeks. Actually, I would probably advise reading it more slowly than I did because it's rich and it is really applicable and deep. And I had to read it quickly enough to be able to do this interview, but I advise reading it slowly. And I do, though, want to welcome you, Rich, to Love is Stronger Than Fear. Thank you for being here.
AJ, thank you so much for the kind invitation. Look forward to a good conversation with you.
Well, I'd love to introduce you to our audience a little bit. So I'd love to hear about New Life Fellowship and specifically what compelled you to write this book, The Deeply Formed Life. I'm sure you've got a lot of demands on your time, and knowing a little bit about your congregation and ministry and how this book came out of that, I think could be really helpful.
Yeah, I've been at New Life for 12 years now. When I got here, I'm from New York City. I'm from Brooklyn, spent the vast majority of my life in Brooklyn, the last 12 years in Queens. And my predecessor, Pete Scazzaro, wrote, who's known for emotionally healthy spirituality, emotionally healthy church, all of that there. He planted the church and in Queens. So it's a very diverse congregation, over 75 nations represented, 123 languages spoken in the neighborhood in Elmhurst. And the diversity spans ethnicity, generation, economics. It's diverse in every sense of the word politically. So it's a very complicated congregation, a beautiful but very complicated congregation. When I wrote this book, I wrote it really, number one, out of pastoral concern. The values that I write about 5 values, really are the values of our congregation. Okay. The difference is in my book, I wanted to use language that was a bit more accessible to people outside of our context. But I had too many conversations with people saying, can you tell me more about contemplative rhythms? Or what can how can I learn more about racial justice and reconciliation? Or tell me a little bit more about theology and spirituality and sexuality, and how do you hold these things together? And so, as opposed to just answering these questions week in and week out in the lobby after the services, I just thought, let me write a book to help people grasp this. And so, much like many people know Eugene Peterson, who translated the Bible into the Message translation.
Yeah, I love that.
That translation came out of pastoral concern for him because he was leading his church through Paul's epistles and recognized that his congregation really didn't know what Paul was getting at. And so Peter said, let me translate it into accessible language. That's essentially what I've attempted to do. And then the other reason that I wrote it is because of the international nature of our context in our congregation. I thought whatever resonates here is going to resonate beyond our church as well because of our diversity. And I was really trying to offer an ambitious reframing of spiritual formation. where I want to be able to see aspects of spirituality and discipleship that's not often included in the spiritual formation category, like race, like sexuality, like justice. And so for me, it was, how can we ambitiously reframe what spiritual formation is for this generation?
I love that. And that is part of what really drew me to your book. And then what I was pleasantly surprised by in your book, because I've read a lot of spiritual formation books. I really like them. I'm like, oh, yes, tell me more about fasting and contemplative prayer and all these things. I'm a big fan. But I love the ways those have equipped me in the past to connect with God in a meaningful way. But what I think your book does is it does those things. It gives a way to really connect with God and to understand the interior life as an integral part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But it's a vision of a deeply formed life that is not only about individuals cultivating a personal, meaningful relationship with God, but actually saying we got to think about spiritual practices as they relate to other people. So you've mentioned some of the values and practices that you wrote about, but could you say why those 5 values and how they relate to each other in your mind, if you have a way that they relate to each other?
Yeah, these values have been worked out in our context. So, for the listener, it's contemplative rhythms, racial reconciliation, interior examination, sexual wholeness, and missional presence. At New Life, we call them our 5 M's. So they're a little different in terms of language. So for us, it's monastic, multiracial, emotional health, marriage to Christ, and missional. And so part of that is, the reason I wrote it is because it's been the slow unfolding of how we've understood formation and following Jesus in our local context. Part of it comes from my predecessor's story of being burned out and having crisis after crisis because he did not know how to navigate his interior world. And so he writes a book called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and then recognizes the pace of New York City, and not just New York City, but the pace of New York City is so frenetic, he needed a different pace. Right. I came to New Life because of those things that he was writing about some 12 years ago. And so it's just been the slow unfolding of local ministry over the years where, we need to slow down. We need to look within. There's 75 nations here. We have to learn how to live together. We're in an area of Queens in which there are a lot of people who are overlooked and under-resourced. 50% of Queens is foreign born. How do we have ministries of justice? There's a lot of marriages in crisis, and young adults coming to our church who are trying to figure out how to steward their bodies and how to intersect their spirituality with their sexuality. Let's just wrestle with that. And so it's just been the organic, slow unfolding. And it was 78 years ago where we named those 5 values. We kind of looking back, I was stepping into the lead pastor role, and I thought I was able to synthesize our journey, and I synthesized it to those 5 areas of ministry. And so, but that's how it came out, really out of this, really inductive approach to understanding, formation and such.
Well, I love how you have woven them together. And I want to hone in a little bit on this. I'll back up a minute. In both our secular culture and in Christian culture, I feel like there's often a gap between spiritual formation and taking action in the world. So there's often a gap between a sense of contemplation and an interior life with God and social commitment and justice being worked out. There's a gap between a life of prayer and, protesting or acting on behalf of the poor or the marginalized or whoever we're talking about. Whereas I think you are trying to really wed those things and demonstrate that there's it's not just that these exist side by side, but they're actually interrelated. So I was wondering if you could talk about that relationship between the inner spiritual life and the outward expression of that inward work with the Spirit.
Yeah, it's a great question. And how I try to outline it in the book and in other places is the task before me in writing this book and in thinking about these things is to resist what I call, formational compartmentalization. And by formational compartmentalization, this flows out of my own story of formation, where I have been, I'm very happy for this, shaped by multiple traditions and streams of Christian historic faith. I've been shaped by the evangelical, the Pentecostal, charismatic, as well as the mainline progressive traditions.
Yeah.
And what I've found is it's often the case that these traditions and these streams get segmented, get compartmentalized. And so in the evangelical tradition, it's often about right thinking, right theology. And the Pentecostal charismatic tradition is often about right experiences. Have you had a particular experience with God that that can be verified, something that's not just interior, but something that happens in the midst of the community? And then there's the right experiences. And then with the progressive kind of mainline, it's right action, right justice, right social engagement in the world. I've been shaped by all of these traditions. And for me, I was thinking, first of all, why do we need to segment them? Why not wrestle to hold these things tightly together? Because what I have seen in each tradition, when there is one emphasis over the other, is going to inevitably lead to a kind of burnout. It's going to lead to a kind of irrelevance. It's going to lead to a kind of duplicity, where there's right thinking, but not right interiority. There's right experiences, but we're not thinking about engagement in the world. Or there's right action, but we're not thinking about how do we love from a deeper place. Not just related to policies and such, but related to how we truly love neighbor as ourselves. So for me, I'm trying to resist all the formational compartmentalization that I see in our world, and saying we can take the best from these various streams and try to offer them up to God. And I see this in Jesus. I mean, Jesus is the model for us, where he has a robust life with God, with the Father in prayer. He's cultivating silence. He's cultivating interior examination. You can argue that after he gets baptized and goes into the wilderness for 40 days, he's being tempted by the evil one. And it's a moment of interiority, a moment of self-examination. And then out of that place, he burst out of the wilderness, offering a word of liberation to people who are oppressed. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. So in Jesus, in that passage right there in Luke 3 and 4, we see these, what we would understand as streams for Jesus, is just who he is. Right. Things are fully formed in him. And so with him as our model, that's what I'm trying to do in terms of resisting that formational compartmentalization.
Yeah, that for me, I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking before that I wrote this book, White Picket Fences, which is a memoir. And it's definitely me struggling as a white woman who is somewhat similar to you. I've had these multiple strands of Christianity where I was kind of baptized into a mainline church, but had a parachurch experience in which the Holy Spirit really came alive for me in high school. And as a result of, had different experiences in different streams of the faith. And I'm really grateful for that. But when I was talking to people about addressing the social divisions we see, whether it's with race or class or political, all these different divisions, so many people said, okay, great, we can acknowledge that these are there, but what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And I was really hesitant to say, go do this, because of both the experience of burnout, because of the sense of superiority that can come if I just go and help people out of my earnest Christian desire to do so, And so I started thinking about the head, the heart, and the hands, which is really what you just described when you were talking about the, kind of intellectual, word-based Protestantism and the experiential and the activism. But what does it mean to actually connect all of those things? And of course, I don't mean to say any of us will do it perfectly all the time. And of course, Jesus is a fantastic model of that in action. But I'm thinking back to the beginning of the book where you talk about the contemplative rhythms. Is that what you call it? Contemplative rhythms?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So contemplative rhythms. And then from there, you go straight into racial reconciliation. And I just would love to hone in a little bit on that in the fast-paced world. And you do a wonderful job of being like, hey, guys, I am not in a monastery. Like, really, I live in Queens. There's a lot going on. There are cars honking outside. And I'm still going to be contemplating, I'm going to be having these rhythms of life. Can you talk a little bit about what those rhythms of life are for you and how that actually is part of that slowing down and that going inward can actually equip us to do the work that God has for us in the world?
Yeah, I do it very painfully here in Queens. I'm 2 blocks away from Queens Boulevard, one of the more famous roads here in New York City, where, thousands of cars are passing by every day. And so for me, what I have focused my life in terms of contemplative rhythms have been a couple of things. Really, first of all, it is that regular weekly practice of keeping Sabbath.
Yeah.
Is this ancient way of slowing down to be with God, a 24-hour period, literal period without any have-tos or shoulds, which over time is to result in deep rest and renewal. And so, for now 12 years, I've been practicing Sabbath weekly from 6 p.m. on Friday evenings to 6 p.m. on Saturday. And it's quite liberating. It's very difficult at first, but it's quite liberating when you realize I'm not a human doing, I'm a human being. Yeah. And I can take an extra nap, or I can delight and cultivate things that bring me joy. And I can have a life outside of my work and my job, that my life doesn't revolve around my life as a pastor, that I can have a life outside of that. So Sabbath has been incredibly instrumental. The thing that's probably most instrumental in my daily life it is contemplative prayer.
Okay.
And I believe all kinds of prayers. Intercessory prayer, petitionary prayer, all kinds of prayer, meditative prayer. Contemplative prayer for me has been the most important element for how I think about race, how I think about the interior life, how I think about justice. Number one, because I do think it's a commitment to a life with God that moves beyond transactionalism. It's a life of shared presence with God, where I'm not trying to get anything out of prayer except sharing presence with God. And whether something gets deposited in me that I recognize or not, the goal is not a particular outcome. The goal is shared presence, in the same way that when I'm sitting down with my wife and enjoying her presence, or with a trusted friend, the goal is not to get anything out of it per se. The goal is just sharing presence. And I do think over time, and all these studies on mindfulness have talked about the ways that the brain is rewired through this kind of silence and meditative prayer. The goal is to be present with God so that I can be present with myself, and then present with my neighbor. And so for me, contemplative prayer serves as the foundation to be present with those who are difficult to love, to be present with those who I disagree with. Next week, I have a couple of meetings with people from our congregation who see the world very differently than I do. Yeah. And they've asked for a meeting, and I don't want to have that meeting. I don't want to sit with them. But what contemplative prayer has trained me to do is, more than anything, to be present with myself, present to God, and present with my neighbor. So whether it's Sabbath, contemplative prayer, of course, there's a slow reading of scripture that somehow gets infused into that. But those are a few of the contemplative practices that have oriented me, not just for my own life with God, but how do I want to witness to Christ, especially in some of the more polarizing, divisive issues that are before us.
And you give some great examples of that in the book. I'm thinking of a cab ride. This is actually in the missional section, I think, but where you're in a cab ride and a woman talks about how she's like spiritual but not religious and doesn't go to church anymore. And instead of being like, well, I'm a pastor, so let me tell you about Jesus and invite you to the next service, you just asked questions and listened and really trusted God to care for her, rather than feeling like, okay, I've got 10 minutes and I can be present to you. That's all I've got, but I can do that. I loved that example. But I want to pause for a minute, knowing that some listeners may hear the words contemplative prayer and not really know what that means, especially in comparison to other types of prayer. So can you describe for a minute what you mean by contemplative prayer? Like, what does it mean to just be present with God and allow God to just be present with you?
Yeah, contemplative prayer in some contexts, some use centering prayer. It is a prayer that is, it's a wordless prayer without words, essentially. It's not for the purpose of putting down a laundry list of things that I need from God.
Mm-hmm.
It's awareness and awakening to God's presence. St. Augustine said, God is closer to us than we are to ourselves.
Mm.
In prayer, we recognize that dimension of loving union with God. And so for me, what that means very practically is I sit in this chair in my bedroom, like I'm sitting in my kind of prayer chair. This is my office. This is my prayer chair. Everything gets done here in my 900 square foot apartment in this chair here. And so for me, what that means is I place my feet on the ground. I open my hands up, palms up in this posture of receiving. I take a deep breath in and out a few times. And then I have a particular phrase or the name Jesus or a phrase like, Lord, here I am. Mm-hmm. And when my mind gets distracted, as it inevitably does in 10 minutes, I simply very gently come back to that phrase. Someone said, I think it was Thomas Keating, a very well-known author who was a Trappist monk, who said, if your mind gets distracted 10,000 or 1,000 times in 10 minutes, it's 1,000 opportunities to come back to Christ, which is a very generous way of understanding prayer, as opposed to, I'm such a bad Christian. Why am I so distracted? No, it's another opportunity to come back to the loving embrace of God. And so for me, I do that for 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. If I want to get ambitious, sometimes 20 minutes. I feel like I'm going to die if I do it for 20 times. Like, I'm going to die right now if I add another minute. But all of this is training me and training my soul and rewiring my brain to be attentive to God and to live beyond the need for stimulation, the need for fruits and results.
Right.
But for me, that's essentially how it is. I have the name of Jesus on my lips, or I have a phrase like, Lord, here I am. Mm-hmm. I very gently, I set my phone for 10 minutes. I breathe in, I whisper it. My mind gets distracted. I come back again. And Henry Nouwen said, it's often the case, who's a very famous author of the 20th century. It's often the case that we don't see growth in the moment. We see it in retrospect. When we look back, we go, wow, look how far I've come. Like Kierkegaard said, we live life forward, but we understand it backwards. It's only when we look back that we realize how far we've come. But that's the agony of prayer. I don't see fruit in the moment. And I think I need to be okay with that. So, but that's for me, the very simple practice of a contemplative prayer.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. And I have only maybe the past 5 years been introduced to that practice of contemplative prayer. And I've similarly found that it's like years into it and I'm still distracted all the time. And yet, learning how to be gracious and to trust in God's graciousness. And as you said, to see that in the moment, I don't see much of what is happening that's changing me, but I do when I look back over those years. So, I want to pivot. Actually, you just mentioned having some members of your own congregation who disagree with you and want to come and talk. And you mentioned in the book just having like every, if you've got a political spectrum, you've got the full array, and you've spoken somewhat to why that would be true in your context. And I know there are lots of pastors, there are lots of Christians, there are lots of lay leaders, there are lots of just families that are experiencing those types of divisions right now in their own households, or, certainly if it was like an extended family. And I'm curious, just again, are there any other than what you've already mentioned, spiritual practices that you would offer in terms of what does it mean to enter into relationship with people where I know we really disagree?
Yeah, there's a few that come to mind. One is not so much a spiritual practice as it is a way of seeing the world. And I draw a lot out of family systems theory. Mm-hmm. It's just an area of interest for me over the years. And as a pastor, I have found it's one of the most important, I think, disciplines for the particular moment that we find ourselves in. And and you could argue that the goal of family systems theory, or the telos, the end to which we want to be growing into, is a life growing in self-differentiation. And self-differentiation is, for me, how I try to explain it and translate it is, it's the process of staying close to myself and staying close to others in times of high anxiety, resisting the polar opposite pull of cutting people off or being enmeshed in them. Now, that is very difficult to do, but that's the ultimate goal. How do I stay close to myself and remain close to others? One of the ways that I think through this, and I talk about some of this in the book, where whenever there's disagreement, or we're seeing the world very differently, there's often reactions, and there's lots of revelation in our reactions if we would just pay attention to them, and the anxiety that comes from the reaction. And so for me, for example, someone says, "Hey, Rich, I heard you preach a message. I really didn't like it. Can we talk about it?" I'm thinking, no.
That's not.
That's what I'm thinking. That's the first response that comes to my mind. But because I'm trying to walk in the Jesus way, after I say no to myself and go no way, and I turn the laptop off, 2 hours later, I open it up again, take a deep breath and go, I guess we can meet, Now, in that moment, before we've even met, I've already come to lots of conclusions, and there's lots of reactions inside of me. And so there's a practice, a 5-step practice that I talk about that has been so helpful whenever anxiety floods my soul and my body, whenever reactions are disproportionate. Sometimes I look at an email, I haven't even read the email. I just see who it's from. And I'm like, dear God, what is it now? And it's, there's, what's that about? And so there's for those listening, the 5 questions that I ask myself, and I think for those who are starting a practice like this, it's going to take that kind of methodical step by step, but after a while, it's going to start flowing pretty freely. The questions are: what happened? What am I feeling? What's the story I'm telling myself? What's the gospel say? And what's the counter-instinctual act that's required of me? So very simply, I'll just play this out, how this happens on a weekly basis with me. So this is, as a pastor of a big church, more, Puff Daddy said, more money, more problems. It's more people, more problems. And so he clearly was not a pastor, Puff Daddy, but it's more people, more problems. So this is a weekly experience for me where I get an email, let's just say, of criticism or disagreement, which happened 3 times last week. And what happened? Received an email of critique from someone in our congregation who I respect, or who has lots of relational power in our congregation. What am I feeling? Fear, shame, embarrassment. What's the story I'm telling myself? I will never be the pastor that I want to be. I'm a failure. What's the gospel say? God has a way of using weak, broken, failing people, and what's the counter-instinctual act that's required for me? And I think it's for most people. The counter-instinctual act for most people is to just look within and internalize it and try to now resolve the issue alone, resolve it. And what's happened for me is that's often the place where I go, internal. I'm obsessing about it, but there is something really powerful about externalizing and naming it to someone else. In good Christian practice, historically, I think this is the practice of confession, where Christians for centuries have held on to, that we need to confess, not just our sins, that's typically but confessing our anxieties, confessing our troubles, our worries. When I confess that and externalize that, especially to my wife, or to the group of pastors that I meet with once a month, or to a therapist that I meet with seasonally, there is, besides it being cathartic, it really, I'm encountered with my frailty, but in that frailty, God encounters me in fresh ways. So in light of all the divisions and anxiety that's being produced politically, racially, theologically, that's been a very important process. And what it does is essentially helps me to navigate my anxiety in a way that moves me beyond freezing or fleeing or just wanting to fight others.
Right. Yeah. Well, so somewhat related to that, so you are in a multi-ethnic church and a multi-ethnic just neighborhood and area of the country. And in your final section, I want to read one. This is about being called to mission outside the church walls. And you talk about the practice of justice and write, practicing justice becomes a possibility when we are present to God and in close proximity to the vulnerable among us. So I'm thinking about people like me, live out in the country and actually, I think there's probably in small towns more proximity to vulnerability than there might be in some suburban centers, just because with more people, you can live in an even more homogeneous way. But certainly, I live in a very white context, and lots of people in our country do live in contexts that are much more homogenous than yours. So for people who are in a church or a personal context that's like that, what does it look like to participate in reconciliation, to participate in justice, to actually have close proximity to the vulnerable among us? What can you say to that?
It's a great question. And it's one that I address on a regular basis pastorally. There are lots of pastors around the country who ask me the same question, like, hey, I'm in this homogeneous context, but I want to be a person who works for racial justice. But there are no Asian people among me, or there are no Black people among me, no Hispanic people among me. How do I do it? And I think it's still possible. First of all, I think what I tell pastors is, who are you allowing to speak into your life? What are the stories that you're opening yourself to? And so even in the books that we read, the music we listen to, the stories that we come across, I think there is moving close to someone isn't necessarily of physical proximity. Sometimes it's emotional proximity. Sometimes it's narrative proximity. I'm trying to understand someone's story. In the simple act of reading and about history of slavery, history of Jim Crow, history of segregation. I mean, and opening ourselves up to that painful historic racial reality. There's proximity, there's empathy that's taking place, so that when an issue comes to the fore, you're going, this comes out of a particular context. So it's often the case that people think physical proximity, and I think by all means, I'm for the physical proximity, but we all know what it's like to have physical proximity, but still be emotionally distant. The proximity before us is, how can I open myself up to the stories, to the fears, to the values, to the beauty of people who don't look like me? And there's a myriad of ways that can come through. And especially in a world of Zoom that we're in right now, this virtual world that we're in, we can open ourselves up to that kind of proximity in new ways that we didn't envision in the past. But proximity is more than just physical. I think at the core of it, it's emotional and spiritual. And folks who are in these monocultural, homogeneous contexts can still move in that direction.
Yeah, I think the idea of narrative proximity. I've never heard those words put together. I love that. And
I've never said it. This is the first
time. Wow, look at you. You coined a great phrase. I really like that. And what I'm also struck by is just when we do expand, as you said, you've got diversity in your church that's not just about multi-ethnic people, but whether it's age or gender or income or disability, but and that is true in any social situation. There are people who are hurting and who are vulnerable. And so what does it mean to have eyes to see those people and to move towards them in love, at least as a beginning of being equipped by God to participate in healing, I think. But I really like narrative proximity. But I wanted to close by just asking you, as I mentioned, the purpose of this podcast is to talk about how we as individuals can participate in healing social divisions in a holistic way. So with our heads, our hearts, and our hands. And I think you do a great job in this book of offering practical ways to incorporate all those aspects of ourselves as we relate to God and to people around us. But so as you think about specifically social healing, all the things that divide us and participating in the work that God is already doing in the world, are there any spiritual practices that you would say are essential for people who really want to participate in social healing, which might be a repetition of what we've already said or adding something new? But I just wanted to end in that sense of like, okay, if you're someone who really cares about this, here are a couple things to really consider as far as being equipped by the Spirit to be a part of a work of healing in the world.
This is actually a good summary of what I'm trying to aim for with my second book here in terms of healing the various divisions that are before us. I think I could express it in this story here. There's a congregant some years ago who was just giving me a hard time. I mean, he saw the world very differently than I did, came from a very different culture, context. And he sent some pretty rough emails, and I was just triggered by him every time I saw him, every conversation we had. And I remember my predecessor at the point, Pete Scazzaro, he said to me, I was just lamenting about a conversation I need to have with him. And he said, do you know this guy, he's experienced some significant trauma. And let me talk about the trauma he's experienced. And he started going into detail about the horrific trauma that he's experienced. Now, of course, I wouldn't know this, but this level of what it did for me in that moment was to recognize there are so many wounded people in the world. Now there are people that you could chalk up and say, well, that's an evil person. That person, that's a wicked Proverbs, wicked person there. There's so many wounded, traumatized people in the world. And when I heard his story and his background, I came to that meeting with a new set of eyes to see the fear beneath the surface, the hurt beneath the surface. And then I began to recognize my own woundedness and the ways that I've been traumatized and the defensiveness that I put up because of fear. I think if we're going to heal our social divisions, there are many different ways and many different layers here, but I do think it begins by seeing the woundedness of every person. Jean Vanier, who sadly many people know, he had some significant missteps of abuse. I just bring his name up because Stanley Hauerwas wrote a book called Living Gently in a Violent World. And I'll just give this for the sake of illustration, where he was talking about Vanier's ways that he sees people. Hauerwas says when he sees an enemy to be conquered, Vanier sees a wound that needs to be healed.
Right.
And I do think that the essence of that truth is, I believe, how Christians can participate in the renewal of the world. We can see people as enemies to be conquered, or see wounds that need to be healed. And that's hard. That's a cruciform way of living. It's painful. It's slow. But I do think if we recognize our own woundedness and start the conversations from that point, we can make more progress than we think.
Well, and it seems to me, I just was thinking, I read a book recently where they just pointed out the root word of hospital and hospitality, obviously being the same. And like the place where you come to get well, the hospital, is the place of welcome and of the banquet, right? Of being able to come and be welcomed as who you are. And I've just been thinking about that relationship, which I think speaks to what you were just saying there. But there is a sense of, there's that saying, hurt people. And I don't think that we are the healers. So saying healed people heal people is a little too trite. But there is a sense of if we have experienced the love of God that has begun a healing work in our lives, we are so much more equipped to actually be able to see the woundedness of other people and bring a taste, at least, or an offering of that same type of healing, perhaps through practices of hospitality, and certainly of justice in the world. And I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't be, signing petitions to change legislation or things like that. But there is a sense of that relational care and welcome that is really transformative for whole communities and really our whole society, I believe. So thank you for writing a book that I think helps us to at least start moving in that direction of healing and of hope. I really, really appreciated your time, really appreciated your words, and I look forward to the next book.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. This one is giving me more trouble than the first one in terms of just trying to get my ideas around it. But hopefully in a few months, things will come together.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. I know how that goes. And yeah, I'm really grateful for your time today.
Thanks, AJ. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. I'm really grateful that you're here. And as always, I'd love for other people to benefit from the ideas and practices that came up in this conversation. So that's on you. If you have a chance to share this podcast, to rate it, to review it, to let other people know about it, that would be a huge help in spreading the word and in spreading the love. I also want to thank our co-host, Breaking Ground. They've got more podcasts, articles, videos. They reflect from a Christian perspective on how to think about the past, understand the present, and explore redemptive possibilities for the future. That's breakingground.us. I'm also so thankful for Jake Hansen, the editor of this podcast, Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, and I'm thankful for you for being here. As you go into your day today, I do hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.